She thought it was just another night on her shift at the prison hospital, until she walked into the cell and heard the prisoner's final request, just hours before his execution. No one expected what she would do next. Stay until the end, because this story will break your heart and leave you thinking about it long after. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's begin. Rebecca Martinez had been working as a nurse at Riverside State Penitentiary for 8 years. At 32, she had seen everything: broken bones from fights, overdoses from smuggled substances, heart attacks from men who couldn't handle the stress of life behind bars. She had stitched wounds, administered medications, and watched men take their final breaths in sterile hospital beds, surrounded by concrete walls instead of family. But nothing had prepared her for what would happen on the night of March 15th, the night that would change her understanding of mercy, compassion, and what it truly means to be human. The prison was quieter than usual. Most of the inmates were locked down for the evening, and the only sounds echoing through the corridors were the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clang of metal doors. Rebecca walked through her rounds methodically, checking on patients, a whisper against the polished floors. She had always in the medical wing. Her soft-soled shoes made barely been different from the other medical staff. Where others saw criminals and murderers, Rebecca saw broken people. She treated each patient with the same gentle care she would give anyone, regardless of what they had done to end up here. Her colleagues sometimes whispered that she was too soft for this job, too kind for a place filled with society's most dangerous individuals. But Rebecca believed that everyone deserved basic human dignity, especially when they were suffering. That night, she carried her usual supplies: a small medical bag with bandages, thermometers, blood pressure cuffs, and pain medications. Her clipboard held the names of 7 inmates she needed to check on before her shift ended at midnight. 6 routine visits for chronic conditions and medication refills. But the 7th name on her list was different. The 7th name belonged to someone she had never met before. Marcus Thompson, 38 years old, scheduled for execution in 18 hours. Rebecca paused outside his cell door, reading the brief medical notes attached to his file. No chronic conditions, no ongoing treatments, no prescriptions. The only notation was a request for a final medical evaluation before his execution. Standard protocol to ensure he was physically fit to die. She took a deep breath and knocked gently on the metal doorframe. The man inside looked up from where he sat on the edge of his narrow bed. Marcus was tall and lean, with graying hair at his temples and eyes that held a depth she hadn't expected. He wasn't what she had imagined. There was no anger in his expression, no hardness that she typically saw in long-term inmates. Instead, he looked tired, resigned, but somehow peaceful. "Good evening," she said softly, stepping into the small space. "I'm Rebecca, the night nurse. I'm here to do your medical check." Marcus nodded and stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Thank you for coming. I know you probably have other patients to see." Rebecca was struck by his politeness, his gentle manner of speaking. She had read his file before coming down here. Marcus had been convicted of armed robbery that resulted in the death of a store clerk 15 years ago. He had maintained his innocence throughout his trial and appeals, claiming the gun had gone off accidentally during a struggle. Whether he was guilty or innocent wasn't her concern tonight. Her job was simply to ensure he was medically stable. She went through the standard procedures: blood pressure normal, heart rate slightly elevated but within acceptable limits, temperature normal, reflexes good. As she worked, Marcus watched her with quiet curiosity, as if he was studying her face, memorizing it. "How are you feeling tonight?" she asked, wrapping up her stethoscope. "Any pain, difficulty breathing, chest discomfort?" "Physically, I'm fine," he replied. "Emotionally, well, that's a different story." Rebecca finished writing her notes but found herself lingering. Something about this man intrigued her. He didn't fit the profile she expected from someone facing execution. There was a gentleness about him, a sadness that seemed deeper than fear of death. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "Do you believe in redemption? Do you think a person can change, even after they've done something terrible?" Rebecca set down her clipboard and really looked at him. In 8 years of working in this prison, no inmate had ever asked her such a profound question. Most were focused on their physical ailments, their complaints about treatment, their anger at the system. But Marcus was asking about something much deeper. "I believe people can change," she said carefully. "I've seen it happen. Even in here. Why do you ask?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the walls of his cell. "Because I have a request, a last wish, I suppose you could call it. But it's not what you might think." Rebecca felt her heart rate quicken. She had heard about last requests before execution. Usually they involved final meals, phone calls to family members, visits from clergy. Sometimes inmates asked for specific books or music. But something in Marcus's tone suggested his request was different. "What is it?" she asked, sitting down in the single plastic chair beside his bed. Marcus took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "There's a woman named Catherine Wells. She lives about 3 hours from here, in a small town called Millbrook. 15 years ago, her husband David was the store clerk who died during my robbery attempt." Rebecca felt the air leave her lungs. She hadn't expected this. "I've spent 15 years in here thinking about her," Marcus continued, "wondering how she's doing, if she has children, if she ever remarried, if she's been able to find peace. I wrote her letters over the years, but I never sent them. I didn't think she'd want to hear from me, and I didn't want to cause her more pain." He reached under his thin mattress and pulled out a shoebox. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, each one addressed to Catherine Wells in careful script. "I know this is unusual, and I know it's asking a lot, but my last wish isn't for myself. It's for her. I want her to know that I'm sorry. Not just sorry that I got caught, not sorry that I'm going to die, but truly sorry for what I took from her. I want her to know that I think about David every day, that I pray for both of them every night, and that if I could trade places with him, I would do it without hesitation." Rebecca stared at the box of letters, her mind racing. This wasn't a typical last request. This was something that could potentially bring more pain to a woman who had already suffered enough, but it could also bring closure, healing, peace. "Marcus," she said slowly, "have you thought about what this might do to her? Opening old wounds right before your execution." "Every day for 15 years, he replied. "That's why I never sent the letters. But now, with 18 hours left, I realize that my silence might be more selfish than my words. What if she needs to hear this? What if she's been waiting for an apology that I've been too afraid to give?" Rebecca looked at this man who was about to die, who was spending his final hours thinking not about himself, but about the woman whose life he had forever changed. She thought about Catherine Wells, somewhere out there, possibly still carrying the weight of her husband's death. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Marcus reached into the shoebox and pulled out a single envelope, different from all the others. This one was sealed, the paper slightly yellowed with age. "I want you to deliver this letter to Catherine personally. Not mail it, not leave it on her doorstep, but hand it to her yourself. I want someone to look her in the eyes and tell her that these words come from a man who spent his last day on earth thinking about her pain instead of his own." Rebecca felt her hands trembling as she stared at the envelope. The weight of what he was asking hit her like a physical blow. Drive 3 hours to find a widow whose husband had been killed by the man sitting in front of her. Look this woman in the face hours before his execution. Marcus and deliver a message from her husband's killer, just, "I'm a nurse, not a messenger service. I can't just leave my job and drive across the state to deliver your letter. I know what I'm asking is impossible," he said quietly. "I know it goes against every rule, every protocol, but sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing or the legal thing. Rebecca stood up abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cell. This was insane. She could lose her job, face legal consequences, destroy her career. But as she looked back at Marcus, she saw something in his eyes that stopped her cold. It wasn't desperation or manipulation. It was genuine remorse, the kind of sorrow that comes from carrying guilt for 15 years. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not ask the chaplain or a social worker or someone whose job actually involves this kind of thing? Because in 8 years of working here, you're the first person who looked at me like I was still human. When you walked in tonight, you didn't see a murderer or a monster. You saw someone who was hurting. That tells me you understand something about compassion that others might not." Rebecca sat back down, her mind spinning. She thought about her own life, her own regrets, the times she had wished for the chance to apologize for things she had done wrong, but her mistakes had never cost someone their life. What if she doesn't want to see me? What if showing up at her door causes her more trauma? Marcus nodded slowly. "That's a risk I've thought about every day for 15 years. But here's what I know about Catherine Wells. After David died, she started a support group for families of crime victims. She volunteers at a crisis center. She turned her grief into something that helps other people heal." "How do you know all this?" Marcus looked embarrassed. "I may have asked other inmates to look her up online when they had computer privileges. I never contacted her, never invaded her privacy directly. But I needed to know she was okay. I needed to know that David's death didn't destroy her completely." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. This man had spent 15 years secretly checking on the welfare of his victim's widow, carrying the weight of her pain alongside his own guilt. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "In my research about Catherine, I learned that she never had children. David died when she was 28, and she never remarried. She spent the last 15 years alone, and I can't help but wonder if part of that loneliness comes from never getting the closure she deserved." The cell fell silent except for the distant sounds of the prison settling into night. Rebecca stared at the letter in her hands, feeling the weight of 15 years of guilt and regret pressed between those pages. What does the letter say? "I tell her about David, about how I think of him every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep. I tell her that I've imagined the life he might have lived, the children he might have had with her, the grandfather he might have become. I tell her that I understand if she hates me, if my words bring her pain instead of peace. But I also tell her that David's death changed me in ways that prison never could." Marcus walked to the small window in his cell, looking out at the parking lot where in a few hours, protesters and supporters would gather for his execution. "I tell her that I found God in here, not the convenient kind of religion that some inmates claim to get sympathy, but real faith that grew from real remorse. I tell her about the literacy program I started, teaching other inmates to read and write. I tell her about the money I've saved from my prison job that I want donated to victims' rights organizations. I tell her that while I can't bring David back, I've tried to honor his memory by becoming someone he might not have been ashamed to know." Rebecca wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. She had worked in this prison for 8 years, had seen hundreds of inmates, had heard countless sob stories and manipulative pleas. But this felt different. This felt real. "The letter isn't asking for forgiveness," Marcus continued. "I don't deserve that, and I wouldn't insult her by requesting it. The letter is simply giving her information she has the right to know, that the man who killed her husband spent his last 15 years becoming someone worthy of the mercy she might choose to give." Rebecca looked at her watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. Marcus had less than 14 hours left to live. If she was going to do this, she would have to leave within the next hour to make the drive to Millbrook and back before her next shift. What happens if I can't find her? What if she's moved or refuses to see me? Then at least I'll know that someone tried, that someone cared enough about doing the right thing to risk something for a stranger. Rebecca stood up again, her decision crystallizing in her mind. She had become a nurse because she wanted to heal people, to ease suffering wherever she found it. Maybe healing didn't always happen in a hospital bed with medicine and bandages. Maybe sometimes healing required taking a 3-hour drive to deliver words that might set 2 souls free. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Marcus closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me, but I have conditions," Rebecca continued. "I'll deliver your letter, but I won't lie to her about who I am or why I'm there. I'll tell her exactly what happened, that you asked me to come, and that you're being executed tomorrow. She has the right to know all of that before she decides whether or not to read your words." Marcus nodded emphatically. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Rebecca took the letter and slipped it into her medical bag alongside her stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. Strange bedfellows, she thought. Tools for saving lives and words from a dying man. "And Marcus," she said, turning back to face him one last time, "I want you to know that whether Catherine forgives you or not, whether this brings her peace or pain, you've shown me something tonight about the power of genuine remorse. That matters too." As Rebecca walked out of Marcus Thompson's cell and toward the prison parking lot, she had no idea that she was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. The drive to Millbrook stretched ahead of her. 3 hours to think about what she would say to a woman whose life had been forever altered by the man who would die tomorrow. The highway stretched endlessly before Rebecca as she drove through the darkness toward Millbrook. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white against the black leather. The letter sat in her passenger seat like a living thing, radiating an energy she could feel even without looking at it. She had called in sick for the remainder of her shift, something she had never done in 8 years of working at Riverside. The lie had come easily, too easily perhaps, but what choice did she have? Tell her supervisor she was driving 3 hours to deliver a death row inmate's apology letter to his victim's widow. They would have her committed for psychiatric evaluation. The radio played softly in the background, but Rebecca barely heard it. Her mind was racing with questions she couldn't answer. What if Catherine Wells had moved? What if she slammed the door in Rebecca's face? What if this entire journey was a mistake that would cause more harm than healing? But beneath all those fears was something else, something that had been growing since she left Marcus's cell. A sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She had become a nurse to help people, to ease suffering, to make a difference in the world. Somewhere along the way, that mission had been reduced to checking blood pressure and dispensing medications. Tonight felt like the first time in years that she was truly doing something that mattered. The GPS on her phone announced she had 2 hours remaining to her destination. 2 hours to figure out what she would say to Catherine Wells. 2 hours to prepare for a conversation that could change 2 lives forever. Rebecca thought about Marcus, alone in his cell, counting down the hours until his execution. She wondered if he was sleeping or lying awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about David Wells and the life that had been cut short 15 years ago. She wondered if he was praying, if he was afraid, if he regretted asking her to make this journey. The miles passed in a blur of darkness and streetlights. Rebecca stopped once for gas and coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she paid the cashier. The young man behind the counter looked at her with concern, asking if she was okay. She managed to smile and told him she was fine, just tired from a long shift. Another lie. But what else could she say? As she got back on the highway, Rebecca realized she was crying. Not the dramatic sobs of grief or fear, but the quiet tears that come when you finally understand the weight of what you're carrying. She was carrying 15 years of guilt, 15 years of unspoken apologies, 15 years of a man's desperate need for redemption. But she was also carrying something else. Hope, the hope that words could heal, that truth could set people free, that mercy was still possible in a world that often seemed devoid of it. The town of Millbrook appeared like a mirage in the darkness, small and quiet. the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Rebecca drove slowly through the empty streets, looking for any sign of life. A few porch lights glowed warmly, and she could see the blue flicker of television screens through living room windows. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a stranger was passing through their town on a mission that would either bring healing or heartbreak. She found Catherine's address using her phone's GPS, a small white house with blue shutters on Maple Street. The yard was well maintained, with flower beds that suggested someone who cared about beauty even in the midst of life's difficulties. A single light glowed in what appeared to be the living room window. Rebecca parked across the street and sat in her car, staring at the house. Inside those walls lived a woman who had been forever changed by the man Rebecca had just left behind. Catherine Wells, now 43 years old, who had spent the last 15 years living with a loss that most people couldn't imagine. The clock on her dashboard read 2:47 a.m. Rebecca realized with a start that she couldn't possibly knock on someone's door at this hour. She would have to wait until morning, which meant she might not make it back to the prison before Marcus's execution. The thought filled her with panic. What if he died believing she had failed him? What if his last thoughts were of disappointment, that his final wish had gone unfulfilled? She pulled out her phone and searched for a nearby hotel, finding a small bed and breakfast just a few blocks away. The proprietor, an elderly woman in a bathrobe, looked at her suspiciously, but accepted her cash payment for a room. Rebecca barely slept, tossing and turning as she thought about what she would say to Catherine in the morning. At 7 a.m., Rebecca sat in her rental car outside Catherine's house again, watching as lights came on in the windows. She saw a figure move past the kitchen window, and her heart began to pound. This was it. There was no turning back now. She walked up the front path on unsteady legs, the letter clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the roses that grew along Catherine's front porch. Rebecca raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Once she knocked on this door, everything would change. For Catherine, for Marcus, for herself. The door opened before she could knock, startling her. A woman with graying blonde hair and kind eyes stood in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress and an expression of curious concern. "Can I help you?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle but cautious. Rebecca felt her mouth go dry. This was Catherine Wells, the woman whose husband had died 15 years ago, the woman who had turned her grief into a mission to help others. She looked older than her years, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of someone who had survived the unthinkable and found a way to keep living. "Mrs. Wells? My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm a nurse at Riverside State Penitentiary. I need to talk to you about Marcus Thompson." Catherine's face went pale, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "Marcus Thompson? The man who killed David?" "Yes, ma'am. He's being executed today. And he asked me to bring you something. May I come in?" Catherine stared at her for a long moment, her eyes searching Rebecca's face for signs of deception or danger. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured for Rebecca to enter. The living room was warm and inviting, filled with photographs and mementos that spoke of a life well lived despite tragedy. Rebecca noticed several pictures of a young man with a gentle smile, presumably David Wells. There were also photos of Catherine with various groups of people, evidence of the community work Marcus had mentioned. "Please sit down," Catherine said, settling into a chair across from Rebecca. "I have to admit, this is the last thing I expected when I woke up this morning." Rebecca sat on the edge of the couch, still clutching the letter. "Mrs. Wells, I want you to know that I've never done anything like this before. Marcus Thompson asked me to deliver this letter to you personally, and I almost said no. But there was something about him, something that made me believe this was important." Catherine's eyes fixed on the envelope in Rebecca's hands. "What does he want? After 15 years, what could he possibly have to say to me? I don't know exactly what the letter says, but I can tell you what he told me. He said he's thought about you and David every day since the robbery. He said he spent 15 years carrying the weight of what he did, and he wanted you to know that he's sorry. Not just sorry he got caught, but truly sorry for what he took from you. Tears began to form in Catherine's eyes. He's really being executed today? Yes, ma'am. In about 10 hours. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter. You know, I've thought about him too over the years. I've wondered if he ever felt remorse, if he ever thought about David as a person instead of just an obstacle in his way. There have been nights when I couldn't sleep, when I wanted nothing more than to hear him say he was sorry. She reached out slowly and took the letter from Rebecca's hands. Her fingers trembled as she held it. This final communication from the man who had changed her life forever. He also wanted you to know, Rebecca continued, that he's tried to become a better person. He's taught other inmates to read. He's found faith. He's donated what little money he's earned to victims' rights organizations. He said he can't bring David back, but he's tried to honor his memory by becoming someone David might not have been ashamed to know. Catherine looked up at Rebecca with surprise. He said that? Those were his exact words. For several minutes, the two women sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling around them like a blanket. Finally, Catherine spoke. Would you mind staying while I read this? I don't think I can do it alone. Rebecca nodded, feeling honored to be trusted with such an intimate moment. Catherine carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Her eyes moved slowly across the handwritten words, occasionally stopping to reread a passage. Rebecca watched as a range of emotions crossed her face. Sadness, anger, surprise, and something that might have been peace. When Catherine finished reading, she carefully folded the letter and held it against her chest. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't seem to be tears of pain. He remembers David, she whispered. He talks about David's laugh, about how he always helped elderly customers carry their groceries to their cars. How could he know those things? I think he spent 15 years learning about the man he killed, Rebecca said softly. Learning about the life he cut short. Catherine wiped her eyes and looked at Rebecca with a new intensity. There's something I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone. The night before David died, we had a fight. A stupid, meaningless fight about money, about whether we could afford to go on vacation that summer. The last words I said to my husband were angry words, and I've carried that guilt for 15 years. Rebecca felt her heart break for this woman who had been carrying her own burden of regret. Marcus writes in this letter that he hopes David knew how much I loved him, that he hopes David's last thoughts were of our happy memories together, not of our fight. He couldn't have known about our fight, but somehow he understood that I might need to hear those words. Catherine stood up and walked to the mantel where a large photograph of David dominated the display. She touched the glass gently, as if caressing his face. I need to ask you something, she said, turning back to Rebecca. Is there any way I can see him before it's too late? Rebecca's heart sank. Mrs. Wells, I don't think that's possible. Executions are scheduled very precisely, and there are strict protocols about who can visit death row inmates. Even if I could arrange it, you'd never make it there in time. Catherine's shoulders slumped with disappointment. I wanted to tell him something. I wanted him to know that I forgive him. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Rebecca felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she realized the magnitude of what she was witnessing. This woman, who had every right to hate Marcus Thompson, who had spent 15 years living with the consequences of his actions, was choosing forgiveness. Mrs. Wells, Rebecca said carefully, I have to drive back to the prison. I probably won't make it in time to see Marcus before his execution, but if there's any chance, any message you'd like me to try to deliver. Catherine wiped her eyes and walked back to her chair, sitting down with the purposeful movement of someone who had made a decision. Yes, she said firmly. There is something I want you to tell him. Rebecca drove through the morning traffic with Catherine's words echoing in her mind. Tell him that David would have forgiven him too. Tell him that love is stronger than death, and that mercy is always possible. Tell him that he gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. the ability to let go of anger and choose peace instead. She arrived at Riverside State Penitentiary with 20 minutes to spare. The parking lot was filled with protesters, media vans, and families of other inmates. Rebecca pushed through the crowd, her nurse's badge getting her through security faster than the others waiting outside. She found Marcus in the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber. His eyes widened when he saw her, hope and fear battling across his face. "I found her," Rebecca said breathlessly. "I delivered your letter." Marcus closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. "What did she say?" "She forgives you, Marcus. She said David would have forgiven you too. She said your letter gave her something she'd been searching for 15 years, peace." For the first time since Rebecca had known him, Marcus smiled. A real smile, filled with gratitude and something that looked like redemption. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me the chance to make things right." 15 minutes later, Marcus Thompson was pronounced dead. But in his final moments, he wasn't alone with his guilt. He carried with him the forgiveness of a woman who chose mercy over hatred, love over revenge. Rebecca returned to her job at the prison, but she was forever changed. She had witnessed something miraculous that night. The power of genuine remorse to transform not just the person seeking forgiveness, but the person offering it. Sometimes healing doesn't happen in a hospital room with medicine and machines. Sometimes it happens on a 3-hour drive through the darkness, carrying words that have the power to set two souls free. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be willing to deliver a message of hope to someone who needs to hear it. What would you have done in Rebecca's place? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in humanity.